Jake betrayed our 15-year friendship by sleeping with my wife and stealing my business partner. Now he's broke and expects me to bail him out of his failures. The morning I found out about Jake and my wife, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, working on quarterly projections for our company. We'd built something incredible together over 5 years, not just Jake and me, but also our third partner who handled all the technical side of things. The three of us had turned a simple idea into something that was finally starting to generate real revenue. My wife walked into the kitchen that Tuesday morning, her hair still messy from sleep, wearing that old college sweatshirt she loved. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me, fidgeting with her wedding ring in a way that immediately put me on edge. I'd known her for 8 years, been married for 6, and I could read every nervous habit she had. She told me she needed space, that I'd been so consumed with work that I'd forgotten how to be a husband. That Jake had been there for her when I wasn't, listening to her concerns about our marriage, helping her realize that she deserved better than someone who prioritized spreadsheets over conversations. The words came out in a rush, like she'd practiced them, and I sat there watching my coffee get cold while my entire world shifted on its axis. What made it worse was how reasonable it all sounded. I had been working long hours. I had been stressed about the company's growth and the pressure that came with early success. I had been bringing that stress home, falling asleep at my desk some nights, missing dinners we'd planned. But Jake had been right there, hadn't he? Coming over for barbecues, staying late after our business meetings to hang out, always ready with a joke or a beer when things got tense. My wife moved out that same week. She said she needed time to figure out what she wanted, that maybe we could work things out if I could learn to balance work and life better. Jake was incredibly supportive during this time, offering to take on more responsibilities at the company so I could focus on my marriage. He'd pat my shoulder and tell me that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is give them the space they need to grow. 3 weeks later, I saw them together at the grocery store. Not talking like friends, not the casual interaction of people who happen to run into each other. They were shopping together, his hand on the small of her back as they debated between different types of pasta, her laughing at something he whispered in her ear. They looked comfortable together, natural, like they'd been doing this for months. I stood there in the cereal aisle holding a box of the healthy stuff my wife always bought, watching them move through the store like a couple, and felt something inside me just go numb. Not angry yet, just completely hollow, like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I left my cart right there and walked out to my car, sat in the parking structure for 20 minutes trying to process what I'd just seen. That night, Jake called me to see how I was doing. Asked if I wanted to grab drinks, said he was worried about me isolating myself. His voice was so sincere, so concerned, and I almost believed that what I'd seen at the store was my imagination playing tricks on me. Almost. I started paying attention after that. Really paying attention. The way Jake would check his phone during our meetings and smile at whatever message he'd received. How he'd suddenly become an expert on marriage counseling and relationship advice, always ready with insights about what women really need from their partners. The way he'd mention running into my wife around town, how she seemed to be doing better, how maybe I should be happy that she was finding herself. Our business partners started acting differently too. Less engaged in our planning sessions, more interested in Jake's ideas about pivoting the company in new directions. They'd have lunch meetings without me, discussing technical implementations that they'd present to me later as finished concepts. I was being slowly pushed out of my own company, and they were doing it so gradually, so professionally, that I couldn't point to any single moment and say this is where the betrayal started. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a routine partner meeting. We were in Jake's home office, the one with the expensive chair and the motivational posters about success and determination. Our technical partner had prepared a presentation about splitting the company, about how they'd identified inefficiencies in our current structure that were holding back growth. They wanted to take the main product, the thing we'd all built together, and spin it off into a separate entity. Jake and our partner would handle the new venture while I stayed with what they called the legacy operations. They had charts and projections showing how this would benefit everyone, how it would allow me to focus on what I did best while freeing them up to innovate. I listened to the whole presentation, nodding at the right moments, asking clarifying questions about revenue splits and intellectual property transfers. They'd thought of everything, covered every legal angle, made it impossible for me to object without looking like I was standing in the way of progress. When they finished, I told them I needed time to review the paperwork. That weekend, I drove to our old college town, 3 hours away from all the mess my life had become. I needed space to think, to figure out how I'd ended up in a situation where my best friend and business partner were essentially staging a corporate coup while my wife found herself in someone else's arms. I stayed in this little bed and breakfast downtown, the kind of place with doilies on every surface and breakfast served on actual china plates. The owner was this elderly woman who'd been running the place for 40 years, and she had this way of making you feel like family within 5 minutes of checking in. She brought me tea without being asked and seemed to understand that I needed to be left alone with my thoughts. I spent 2 days walking around campus, sitting in coffee shops where I'd spent countless hours as a student, remembering who I used to be before mortgages and quarterly reports and marriage counseling became my reality. I thought about Jake and how we'd met freshman year, how we'd stayed up all night talking about the businesses we'd start someday, the lives we'd build, the way we'd always have each other's backs no matter what. On Sunday morning, I was sitting in this little diner off campus, working through my 3rd cup of coffee and a stack of pancakes I didn't really want when my phone rang. It was my wife calling to tell me that she'd made her decision. She wanted a divorce. She was sorry, but she'd realized that our marriage had been over for months before she'd even admitted it to herself. She hoped we could stay friends, hoped I'd understand that sometimes people grow apart, that it wasn't anyone's fault. I listened to her explain how Jake had helped her see that she deserved to be with someone who prioritized her, someone who was emotionally available, someone who shared her values about work-life balance. She never explicitly said they were together, but she didn't need to. The way she talked about him, the familiarity in her voice when she mentioned his name, the careful way she avoided directly answering when I asked if there was someone else. I drove home that afternoon feeling like I was returning to someone else's life. My house felt too big and too quiet, full of furniture we'd picked out together and photos from vacations that seemed like they'd happened to different people. I sat in my living room that night, looking at a picture from our wedding day where Jake was standing next to me in his groomsman tux, both of us grinning like we'd just pulled off the best joke in the world. The next morning, I went to the office early before Jake or our partner usually arrived. I needed to look at the paperwork they presented, really examine what they were proposing, figure out what my options were. The documents were thorough, professionally prepared, clearly the result of weeks of planning. They'd even included transition timelines and communication strategies for telling our employees about the restructure. What struck me most was how inevitable they'd made it all seem. Like the split was just a natural evolution of our business relationship, like staying together would be holding everyone back from their full potential. They'd positioned it as a win-win scenario, an opportunity for growth and specialization that would benefit all parties involved. But reading through the fine print, seeing exactly how they divided up our intellectual property and client relationships, I realized this wasn't a restructure at all. This was them taking everything valuable and leaving me with the administrative overhead and the office lease. They'd even calculated my projected revenue after the split, and it was just enough to keep the lights on while they built something bigger with the foundation we'd created together. I spent the next 2 weeks pretending to consider their proposal while actually consulting with lawyers and accountants, trying to understand what my real options were. The legal reality was complicated. We'd structured our partnership in a way that gave all 3 of us significant decision-making power, but their proposal was technically within the bounds of our original agreement. My lawyer was this sharp woman in her 50s who'd handled dozens of partnership dissolutions. She explained that while what Jake and our partner were doing might feel like betrayal, it was probably legal as long as they followed the proper procedures. She could help me negotiate better terms, maybe secure a larger percentage of the ongoing revenue, but she couldn't stop them from leaving if that's what they really wanted to do. The divorce lawyer was less optimistic. My wife had filed first, claiming irreconcilable differences, and given that we'd only been married 6 years in a no-fault state, the financial implications were relatively straightforward. We'd split our shared assets. I'd keep the house since I could afford the mortgage on my own, and we'd both walk away free to start over. 3 weeks after that meeting in Jake's office, I told them I'd agree to the split. I negotiated a few minor changes to the terms, a slightly higher percentage of residual revenue, a longer transition period for client handoffs, but mostly I just wanted to get it over with. The betrayal was complete, had been complete from the moment they'd started planning behind my back, and fighting about the details wasn't going to change the fundamental reality of what they'd done. The actual dissolution took 2 months to finalize. 2 months of awkward meetings and tense conversations about who would take which clients, which employees would go with the new venture, how we'd communicate the changes to our industry contacts. Jake tried to maintain his friendly demeanor throughout the process, acting like we were just business partners making a strategic decision rather than friends ending a 15-year relationship. Our technical partner was more honest about the situation at least. He admitted that he thought Jake's vision for the company was more aligned with where the industry was heading, that he believed the new venture had better growth potential. He seemed genuinely sorry about how things had worked out, but not sorry enough to change his mind. The day we signed the final paperwork, Jake suggested we grab drinks to celebrate our new chapters. He talked about how excited he was about the opportunities ahead, how the split was really the best thing for everyone involved, how he hoped we'd stay in touch. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but all I could think about was how comfortable he seemed with it all, how easily he'd rationalized away 15 years of friendship. My wife's divorce papers arrived the same week the business dissolution was finalized. She'd moved in with Jake by then, though they were still pretending it was just a temporary arrangement while she figured out her next steps. The timing felt intentionally cruel, like they'd coordinated the end of my marriage and my business partnership to maximize the impact. I signed the divorce papers on a Thursday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and a stack of documents that would legally end my marriage. The whole process felt surreal, reducing 8 years of shared life to a series of asset divisions and custody arrangements for our dog, who would stay with me since I kept the house. Update 1. 6 months after the divorce was finalized and the business split was complete, I was living in a completely different world. My house felt like a museum of my old life, too big, too quiet, filled with furniture and decorations that belonged to the person I used to be when I was married and had business partners I trusted. I'd kept the dog, a golden retriever mix we'd rescued 3 years earlier, and she became my constant companion during those first months of rebuilding. She'd follow me from room to room, seeming to sense that I needed the company, and I found myself talking to her more than I talked to actual humans some days. Walking her twice a day gave structure to my routine and forced me to leave the house even when I didn't feel like facing the world. The remnants of my business were smaller than I'd expected, but more solid than Jake and our former partner had probably hoped. They'd taken the flashy new product and most of our high-profile clients, but they'd left me with the steady, reliable revenue streams and the operational infrastructure that actually kept everything running. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was profitable, and it gave me a foundation to build from. I spent those first months automating everything I could, streamlining processes that had grown complicated when we were trying to manage rapid growth with 3 different management styles. Without the constant meetings and collaborative decision-making, I could move faster, make changes more efficiently, focus on what actually worked rather than what looked impressive in investor presentations. The loneliness was the hardest part. I'd gone from having a wife to come home to and business partners to strategize with to spending most of my time alone with my thoughts and my dog. I tried dating briefly, a few awkward coffee meetings with women I'd connected with online, but I wasn't ready for it. Every conversation felt like I was performing the role of someone who had his life together rather than actually being that person. My social circle had essentially disappeared with my marriage and business partnership. Most of our couple friends had naturally gravitated toward my ex-wife and Jake, who were now openly together and seemed to be enjoying playing the role of the relationship that had overcome obstacles to find true love. Our business contacts were split between those who'd followed Jake to the new venture and those who were maintaining professional relationships with both companies while privately taking sides. I started going to the gym regularly, partly because I needed something to do with all the time I used to spend in partner meetings, and partly because physical exhaustion was sometimes the only way I could get my brain to stop analyzing everything that had gone wrong. I'd run on the treadmill until my legs hurt, lift weights until my arms shook, take long bike rides through neighborhoods where I didn't know anyone and no one knew my story. One evening, about 8 months after everything fell apart, I was at the grocery store picking up dog food and frozen dinners when I ran into Jake's mom. She'd always been kind to me, had treated me like a second son throughout our friendship, and seeing her in the cereal aisle brought back memories of family barbecues and holiday celebrations when Jake and I were inseparable. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, asked how I was doing, mentioned that she'd heard I was keeping busy with work. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She mentioned how worried she'd been about Jake lately, how his new business venture was more stressful than he'd expected, how he seemed overwhelmed by the responsibilities of being the primary decision-maker. She didn't say anything directly critical about my ex-wife, but there was something in her tone when she mentioned how different Jake seemed since he'd gotten serious about someone new. She said he used to call her every week, but now she was lucky to hear from him once a month, and when they did talk, he seemed distracted, always rushing to get off the phone. I left that conversation feeling confused rather than vindicated. Part of me had been hoping that Jake's new life would fall apart, that he'd realize what he'd given up when he destroyed our friendship. But hearing his mother's concerns just made me sad for all of us, for the friendship we'd lost, for the complications he'd created in his own life, for the mess we'd all made of relationships that used to be simple and genuine. Around the same time, I started hearing rumors through industry contacts about problems at Jake's new company. Nothing concrete, just whispers about missed deadlines and budget overruns, investors asking harder questions about their business model, key employees leaving for competitors. Our former technical partner had apparently been struggling to manage both the development side and the operational challenges they'd inherited when they'd taken on the more complex parts of our original business. I tried not to pay attention to these rumors, tried to focus on growing my own company rather than tracking the success or failure of my former partners. But it was impossible not to feel some satisfaction when I heard that their big product launch had been delayed, that they'd had to let go of some of the employees they'd hired away from our original company. My own business was doing better than I'd expected. Without the overhead of supporting Jake's expensive ideas and our technical partner's perfectionist tendencies, I could operate more efficiently and respond more quickly to client needs. I'd kept the boring, reliable clients that actually paid their bills on time, and I was discovering that boring and reliable could be quite profitable when you weren't constantly reinvesting everything into the next big breakthrough. I hired a small team of freelancers to help with the increased workload. People who could work remotely and didn't require the expensive office space and benefits packages that had been eating into our margins when we were trying to look like a major player in the industry. It was a leaner operation, but it was mine, and every decision I made was based on what would actually improve the business rather than what would impress investors or industry publications. 1 year after the split, I was making more money than I'd ever made as part of the original partnership. Not because I was doing anything revolutionary, but because I'd eliminated the inefficiencies and ego-driven decisions that had been holding us back. I was sleeping better, eating healthier, spending time on hobbies I'd neglected when my life was consumed by marriage counseling and partnership meetings. But I was also lonely in a way that success couldn't fix. I'd built something solid, but I'd built it alone, and there were still moments when I'd want to call Jake to share good news or brainstorm about a problem, only to remember that he was no longer someone I could trust with either my successes or my struggles. The second year brought unexpected opportunities. A larger company approached me about acquiring some of my clients, offering terms that would let me maintain operational control while giving me access to their resources and market reach. It was the kind of deal that Jake would have dismissed as thinking too small, but it was exactly what my streamlined operation needed to scale efficiently. I negotiated carefully, taking my time to understand exactly what they were offering and what they expected in return. The process took 6 months, but the final agreement gave me the best of both worlds, financial backing to expand without giving up the autonomy that had made my post-partnership business so much more manageable. By the end of that second year, I doubled my revenue and built a company culture that actually reflected my values rather than trying to accommodate 3 different visions of what success should look like. I was working with clients I respected, solving problems that mattered, building something sustainable rather than chasing the kind of explosive growth that often leads to spectacular failures. I still thought about Jake sometimes, wondered how he was doing, whether he ever missed our friendship or regretted the choices he'd made. But those thoughts came less frequently, and when they did, they felt more like curiosity about an old acquaintance rather than the sharp pain of betrayal that had dominated my first year alone. Update 2. The third year brought news I hadn't expected. I was at an industry conference, one of those events where everyone networks aggressively and pretends that coincidental meetings are actually valuable business opportunities, when I overheard a conversation that made me stop dead in my tracks. 2 consultants were discussing recent failures in our sector, and one of them mentioned Jake's company by name. They'd apparently run out of funding 6 months earlier and had been trying to find a buyer for their assets ever since. The technical challenges had proven more complex than anticipated, their major client had pulled out after a series of delivery delays, and their burn rate had been unsustainable from the beginning. The consultant mentioned that our former technical partner had already found a new position with an established firm, but that Jake was struggling to land anywhere comparable. His reputation had taken a hit from the company's failure, and potential employers were asking questions about his leadership style and decision-making process during the final months before everything collapsed. I left the conference feeling a mixture of emotions I hadn't expected. There was some vindication, certainly. The risky strategy that had justified breaking up our original partnership had failed spectacularly, proving that maybe my cautious approach hadn't been holding everyone back after all. But there was also genuine sadness for what Jake had lost, not just professionally but personally. A few weeks later, I got a call from our former technical partner. He wanted to meet for lunch, said he had some things he wanted to discuss about potential opportunities for collaboration. I was curious enough to agree, though I wasn't sure what kind of collaboration would make sense given our history. He looked tired when we met, older than the 3 years since our split would normally account for. He ordered coffee but barely touched his sandwich, spending most of the meal apologizing for how things had ended between us. He explained that he'd gotten caught up in Jake's vision for rapid growth and market disruption, that he'd convinced himself that leaving our stable partnership was necessary for his career development. The new venture had been exciting at first, he said. They'd had access to more funding than our original company, could afford better equipment and more ambitious projects, attracted attention from investors and industry publications. But the pressure to deliver extraordinary results had been constant and ultimately unsustainable. Jake had changed once he was the primary decision-maker, becoming impatient with the careful development processes that had made our original company reliable. He'd pushed for faster timelines, bigger promises to clients, more aggressive marketing than their actual capabilities could support. When problems emerged, his response was always to work harder and move faster rather than step back and reassess their approach. Our former partner asked if I'd be interested in having him return to work with me, not as a full partner but as a senior employee who could handle the technical challenges that came with the larger contracts I was now managing. He acknowledged that he'd have to rebuild trust, that he'd proven he was capable of making poor decisions when presented with attractive alternatives to stability and steady growth. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to complicate the clean, efficient operation I'd built. Working alone had taught me how much of our original partnership's stress had come from trying to accommodate 3 different work styles and risk tolerances. I'd created something that worked for me, and adding back someone who'd already demonstrated questionable loyalty seemed like an unnecessary risk. That same month, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Jake and my ex-wife were having problems. The stress of his business failure was apparently affecting their relationship, and she was discovering that the financial security she'd expected from being with a successful entrepreneur was less certain than she'd anticipated. They'd moved to a smaller apartment, she'd had to find a job for the first time in years, and the dynamic between them was shifting in ways that neither of them had expected. I felt surprisingly little satisfaction hearing about their relationship troubles. The anger that had sustained me through the first year after the betrayal had faded into something more like indifference. Their problems were their problems, and my life had moved far enough beyond what they'd done to me that their struggles felt irrelevant to my current reality. But then I got a text message that changed everything. It was from my ex-wife asking if we could meet for coffee. She said she had something important to tell me, something she should have told me years ago, something that would explain a lot about what had really happened between us. She promised it would be worth my time, that it would answer questions I'd probably stopped asking but that still deserved answers. I stared at that message for 3 days before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely to maintain the clean separation I'd worked so hard to achieve. Part of me was curious despite myself, wondering what kind of revelation she thought could possibly matter at this point. And part of me, the part that had never completely healed from the betrayal, wanted to hear what she had to say. We met at a coffee shop across town from my house, somewhere neutral where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. She looked different than I remembered, thinner, more tired, wearing clothes that were nice but not expensive in the way she'd preferred when we were married. She ordered green tea instead of the elaborate coffee drinks she used to love, and I noticed her wedding ring was gone. She started by apologizing, not just for the affair and the divorce, but for something deeper that I hadn't understood at the time. She said that everything I thought I knew about what had happened between her and Jake was wrong, that the story I'd constructed about their relationship was based on a lie she'd helped create. Then she told me something that reframed 3 years of my life in a way I hadn't seen coming. She said she'd never actually had an affair with Jake. That the whole relationship had been an elaborate performance designed to expose something we'd both suspected about his character but couldn't prove. She'd noticed him making comments about our marriage, subtle suggestions that I was taking her for granted, offers to be there for her when I was busy with work. The grocery store encounter I'd witnessed had been staged after weeks of Jake making increasingly inappropriate advances that she'd been documenting. She explained that we'd grown apart in our marriage, that was real, but not because of anything Jake had pointed out to her. We'd been struggling to connect for months before Jake inserted himself into our problems. But his attempts to position himself as the solution to her unhappiness had made us both realize how manipulative he could be when he wanted something that belonged to someone else. The divorce had been genuine, we really had grown apart, really had wanted different things from our lives going forward. But the timing had been coordinated to coincide with Jake's business proposal to make him feel confident that he'd successfully orchestrated the collapse of both my marriage and my business partnership while positioning himself as the hero in both situations. She'd moved in with him temporarily to maintain the illusion, but they'd never been romantically involved. She'd been gathering information about his business plans, his real financial situation, his treatment of employees and clients, building a case for why his new venture was likely to fail and why our original technical partner might want to reconsider his decision to join Jake's company. I sat there listening to this explanation, trying to process what it meant, trying to understand why they'd put me through 3 years of believing that my best friend had stolen my wife and destroyed my marriage out of selfishness and betrayal. The relief I felt learning that the affair had been fake was overwhelmed by anger that they'd let me suffer through the humiliation and loneliness of thinking I'd been betrayed in the most personal way possible.